I invite you to stand as you're able to do so and join in singing our first hymn, Morning is Broken.
Good morning, and please remain standing as we recite our covenant. I'd like to invite Don Keckler to come up to light our chalice. Enriched by our differences and joined together in our search for meaning, we covenant with ourselves and each other to seek truth in a spirit of love, to strive for justice, and to serve others with a joyful heart.
So I'd like you to reach around and shake hands with people near you and say, good morning, good to see you, happy Jew.
Okay, good morning, good morning, good morning. What a wonderful, beautiful morning. Good morning, Donald. If you're viewing this service on Zoom, please remember that you can activate the closed captioning if that is helpful to you. And if you'd like to talk with others after the service, there'll be a virtual coffee hour. And we'll have a coffee hour in Fellowship Hall here that I hope folks can join us for. Let's see, one announcement, a couple announcements. One is, I believe, next Sunday, I hope you'll be able to come back for it, will be the last Sunday Reverend Roger will be preaching from this pulpit. Oh. Now, I won't be able to be here next Sunday. Oh. And I'll take personal privilege now to say my goodbye. Now, who would take a job to replace a minister who was greatly loved for 16 years? Reverend Peter Friedrichs. Well, it was Roger. In fact, I heard that Roger at one point said, I can do that job, even with my arm tied behind my back. And then he thought, you know what, I'll break my arm and have it in a sling, and I'll do it that way too. Roger, personally, and I know others share this, and I won't be here next week, but I am so, so grateful to have gotten to know you and to have you here ushering our church into this period of transition. The wisdom you brought to us, the dedication you brought to us, the insights you brought to us about a congregation that's going through change have been super important as we continue on this journey. I'm so grateful to you. Thank you so much, and I wish the best for you as you continue on your journey.
Thank you.
Now, we'll start with our centering song. Bob?
Some church traditions include on Sunday or during the week lighting a votive candle in memory of someone that maybe have died or in hopes that someone will get better from an illness. But that would be awkward in this room to light all these candles and kind of the smell of the oil burn or the wax burning and all that, and a little danger of fire. So we have found a new way to do essentially the same exercise, which is to place a stone in this bowl of water as a way of expressing our joys or our sorrows, honoring those feelings by dropping stones in this bowl of water. Just as the stones are held by water, so are all who drop them held and loved by this community. Please file up the aisle by the window. You mostly know how to do this. And return down the center aisle. And all of you are invited to join in the ritual if you wish to do so. And those online can join us by entering joys and sorrows into the chat. And this morning I drop a stone for church member Doug Cook, who died Friday after a long illness. And I drop a final stone for the joys and sorrows held by those online and those who were unable to be with us today. The reading this morning is by my colleague, the Reverend Mark Morrison Reed. Mark wrote this, I think, about 20 years ago, so there's a place in the reading where he says, my father is still doing this, and I think by now his father has died because it was written 20 years ago. Mark is a retired African-American Unitarian Universalist minister. He was born in 1949 and raised in Hyde Park near the University of Chicago. And I should explain to you who are not familiar with the history of Chicago, until 1948, the year before Mark was born, Hyde Park was almost exclusively a white neighborhood surrounded by African Americans. Mark's father was a nuclear chemist at the university, and his mother was a director of social work at a local hospital. In his autobiography, Mark described how his family became Unitarian. They were young, just like some of the kids who are here today. Our family ended up Unitarians because one Sunday morning, Dad observed my brother Philip and me peering out the window of our house at the families headed for church in their Sunday best. And my dad said to himself, I don't like this void. We're gotta go somewhere, gotta be something. He had been raised a Christian Scientist, so that's where he took us. But when we got home, Mother said, no more of that. And the two of them had it out. Well, Dad reported the argument to his colleague, our uncle, who invited our family to accompany him to the Unitarian Church near the University of Chicago campus. Mother took Philip, Carol, and me. She liked it. And the next week, Dad came with us. 50 years later, he still attends that congregation. And Mother is there as well, interred in the crypt beneath the church. In 1954, Dad cradled infant Carol while Philip and I, wearing matching plaid sports jackets, stood in front of the congregation to be christened, the first Negro children named and dedicated in the First Unitarian Society of Chicago since its founding in 1836. Once again, we were on the vanguard of integration. By the mid-60s, the congregation was 15% African American, and today about a third of its members are people of color. At times, my life felt like an excruciating experiment. Racial integration meant being one of a few Negroes in a sea of white. It meant awkward situations and embarrassment lurked near, and so fostered in me an almost aberrant cautiousness. At 8, I was a skinny, bespectacled soprano in the congregation's children's choir. Today, it's known as the Chicago Children's Choir, a multicultural, multiracial choir that has grown to more than 3,000 children. I knew a lot of the kids from the Sunday school and found in the choir a sense of camaraderie that I didn't experience on the block. Nevertheless, before Philip joined, when I looked around Woodman Hall in the church, the only other person I saw with brown skin was a pig-tailed Ermetra, and now and then, growing self-conscious, I would look away because I did not want to notice that we were the only ones. Let myself remember that we were different and I would feel alone. apprehensive, and confused. Yet every time I looked up, there she was. It's no accident that the Unitarian Children's Choir later developed such rich diversity. In 1947, a light brown-skinned college student named Polly McCoo became a teacher in the Sunday school. At the same time, the congregation's Women's Alliance brought forward a resolution to invite our friends of other races and colors who are interested in Unitarianism to join our church. Well, this resolution in 1947 set off a storm. The church bylaws included a clause that denied membership to Negroes. The minister, Leslie Pendleton, threatened to resign unless the clause was changed and the new resolution adopted. This led to a board meeting that raged into the night until finally the two board members who opposed integration caved in. At the end, someone suggested they sing Amazing Grace. But however sweet the sound may have seemed that evening, in 1947, once the congregation passed the resolution, the opposing board members left the church. The next spring, when Polly joined the Chicago Unitarian Church, the president declared to her father, "We don't mind if members are like your daughter." With that disturbing welcome, the slow process of integration began. One Negro joined, the next year another. My family started attending in 1953. At that time, only a dozen of the more than 500 Unitarian congregations in the United States had 5 or more Negro members. Most had none, and other denominations were similar. No matter how much integration took place during the rest of the week, on Sunday mornings, the races went their separate ways. Unitarian minister Homer Jack, a founder of the Congress of Racial Equality, once called Sunday at 11 the segregation hour. Let's sing Spirit of Life.
So now is a time when we take our offering. But I want to take you back a year. It could be 5 years. It could be 10 years. It could be 20 years. And what was different then than today? Then there are fans in the windows. The windows were propped up. You couldn't hear the minister because we didn't have air conditioning. This morning, we have air conditioning. And why do we have air conditioning? Because you've been generous with your offering over the years. So you can text to give. There are baskets in the back, and we ask you to give generously. And if you don't, we're turning it off in July. My Juneteenth reflection, my personal Juneteenth, occurred not in 1865 or 2021, but on a fall day in 1966. Now that may sound odd, my Juneteenth, but I think we can view the historical Juneteenth as more of a beginning, really, than an end. Do we really think black people suddenly became free and independent in Texas on June 19th, 1865? No, not really. But it certainly was an important beginning. My Juneteenth, my beginning for addressing racism in my life, started the day in 1966. I walked into Archbishop John Carroll High School in Washington, D.C. as a freshman. My family lived in a segregated suburb outside the District of Columbia. And while the N-word was not used in our house, the racist attitudes of my parents and brothers were barely hidden. This left a mark on me. And while I was aware of the civil rights movement going on in the 1960s, I was not even close to being a sympathizer. So finding myself in a first period classroom where maybe 1/3 of the students were black was a shock. At first, I was confused, wary, maybe sometimes afraid. But over the next 4 years, and often due to the mentorship of the Augustinian priests who taught us, I began to deal, albeit slowly, with my own racism. For me, my growth came mostly from the personal experience and face-to-face contact with people whose faces didn't look like mine, but whose hearts and minds I learned I could find commonality with. And it didn't hurt that this opportunity to change my views came during my teen years when I was ready to fight against my parents' views on virtually any topic. I think our political leaders who passed the Juneteenth law 2 years ago mostly considered it an opportunity to celebrate an important event in the struggle against racial injustice in our country. And so it should be celebrated. But it was not the solution. And after all, it took 151 years, bloody years, to make it a holiday. And today, we still struggle. So I've been thinking that maybe Juneteenth also offers us, me, maybe you, an opportunity to reflect on our own Juneteenth event that began our personal struggle against racism. My time at John Carroll High School didn't end my own racist attitudes and actions. It was only a beginning. But reflecting on beginnings can be important. Beginnings offer us a milestone to see where we have come from, where we are today, and hopefully can inspire us to continue with even greater commitment our work against racism, injustice, and white supremacy. This Juneteenth, let's also celebrate the work we started and recommit to the work we know that is far from complete. Happy Juneteenth.
Thank you. So Juneteenth was first celebrated in black churches in Texas after the Civil War, but it got all the way to Pennsylvania in 2019 when Pennsylvania's governor signed legislation designating June 19th as Juneteenth National Freedom Day. In recognition of this day, I want to talk about my own small efforts to decrease the evil of white privilege in our culture. And as I talk about my experiences, I imagine, I hope that it will trigger in your own memories, your own experiences with this. I grew up in Phoenix, Arizona. My parents' neighborhood was made up mostly of people who had European ancestry. Citywide, this was 46% of the population. African Americans made up 7% of the city of Phoenix when I was a child, and they all lived in South Phoenix. As a German American child, I had almost no contact, no connection, no understanding of the lives of African Americans. I was influenced by the dominant culture, mostly white teachers, bigoted neighbors, racial stereotypes, whites in films and on television, blacks' absence from the history books, white politicians, headlines on black crime, a white Jesus, a white Tarzan conquering the black savages, black men described as lazy workers, whiteness as pure, clean, and good, blackness as tainted and dirty. These were all the reinforcements for prejudice in my childhood. They pointed to white supremacy. The message was embedded in the social institutions and ingrained in everyday language. Now, to their credit, my parents fought hard against this dominant culture. My parents taught me to treat everyone equally, regardless of skin color. They were extremely aggressive about this. They would get very angry at me if I did anything that they felt was inappropriate. All racial discrimination, they told me firmly, was wrong. I also learned this in church. I remember in September of 1993, when I was 12 years old, we were riding a car as my parents drove home from the Phoenix Unitarian Universalist Church. And they were very upset that afternoon as we drove home because the minister of the church had announced during the service that there was news reports that the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama had been bombed on Sunday morning, a church. 4 little girls were dead. The phrase white privilege had not yet been invented, but this was white privilege. We could go to church on Sunday without the fear of being killed by a bomb. African Americans could not. In the months that followed, a member of that church created 4 larger-than-life statues representing the 4 girls who had been killed in Birmingham. And today those statues are in the memorial garden of that church in Phoenix. Back in March of 1965, we heard the news that James Reeb, a Unitarian Universalist minister, had been killed in Selma marching for voting rights. Phoenix Unitarians felt a personal connection because Reverend Clark Olson, one of the ministers who had been walking with Reverend Reeb, was the son of the former minister of the Phoenix church. I remember my dad getting a phone call asking him to contribute to a special fund to pay to send the Phoenix minister to march in Selma. And I remember attending the Sunday service when our minister returned. The church was full to overflowing. The message that my parents and my church taught me was that racism was wrong, and it became more of a reality as I grew older. My church sent me to a week-long camp for high school-age kids in 1966. It was run by the National Conference of Christians and Jews. Today we would call it anti-racism training or anti-oppression training. We spent hours hearing stories and talking in discussion groups about the civil rights issues of the mid-1960s. Out of the experience, we formed fellowship clubs in our high schools to combat racism, to encourage whites and blacks to talk about racism. Out of that, I became close friends with a young woman in my high school named Liz Ragsdale. She was the daughter of Lincoln Ragsdale, a Tuskegee Airman, a leader in the Phoenix area civil rights movement. He was a member of the Unitarian Universalist Church, and Liz was my first African American friend. She educated me. She taught me about her life and about white privilege. Together, we were in the Unitarian Universalist High School youth group, and we attended the same high school together, and then later we attended Arizona State University at the same time. As a teenager, I bought a copy of the autobiography of Mahatma Gandhi at the small church bookstore at the church, and I read about nonviolence. I started to follow in the news the stories of Dr. King's nonviolent campaigns to end racism. I wanted to experience this nonviolent campaign firsthand, so I looked around for an opportunity to participate in a nonviolent protest. I heard about a man named Cesar Chavez and the United Farm Workers Labor Union. Chavez was coming to Phoenix to speak, I read in the newspaper. And at the age of 16, I got my dad to loan me his pickup truck, and I drove down to the Union Hall to hear Cesar Chavez. Of course, it was all in Spanish. I was the clueless, shy white kid in the back of the room that day. 5 years later, in 1972, Cesar Chavez was again in Phoenix, this time fasting for farm workers' rights. One evening, I went to Santa Rita Hall, and I joined 1,000 other people. I remember the room was packed, and I was up against the wall in the back. Coretta Scott King was there. She came to Phoenix to take communion at this Catholic Mass with Chavez. The wine was Union wine, they announced, and the host was tortilla chips. Coretta King said how much she admired Chavez's philosophy of nonviolence, so much like her husband's. I thought to myself, I want to be part of this. I want to be a nonviolent soldier in the fight to end racism. Serving as a minister for 45 years, I've tried not simply to express my moral outrage on Sunday mornings, but to work to bring about change. I've been less interested in mission statements and vision statements. In fact, I've always signed on to every church mission statement and vision statement that's ever been written because they all seem very good to me. But I've been more interested in effective actions. I had big expectations for myself when I started in the ministry. However, looking back now, my efforts feel small. In May of 1979, I was serving as a minister in Lexington, Kentucky, and I got a letter from the NAACP Fair Housing Coalition. They invited me to be a tester for the city's fair housing. I was paired with a black man named George Shanks, who worked as a nurse at the Veterans Hospital. Everything was done in strict secrecy, and George gave me the nickname of 007. If word got out that we were testing for fair housing, the discrimination that we would normally find might disappear temporarily. George and I were given roles to play. We were told that we were to say that we each worked at similar places, that we each earned similar incomes, that we were each married. I was single then, but I was to say I was married, and that we each had one child. This was so that we would have identical characteristics. The only difference was our skin color. For our first test, George and I agreed to rendezvous in a shopping center parking lot. We rehearsed our stories, and then we flipped a coin to see who would go in first. I won the toss, and I drove over to an apartment complex. I went into the rental office. The assistant manager asked me some questions, and then she gave me a key to an apartment, along with directions, and she invited me to go over and take a look at it, which I did. And I came back, returned the key, and then I returned to the shopping center, and I waved George in. We weren't supposed to talk at all because that would prejudice the experiment. Later, he told me what happened. He met the same person. She told him that there was an apartment available, but she did not offer to show George the apartment, and she did not give George the key so that he could look on his own. So it began. By June of 1979, George and I and other testers had finished our assignments. There were some 40 factors involved in the record keeping. We had a booklet that we would keep the records in for each test. Did the agent shake your hand when you came into the office? Did they offer you a cup of coffee? 40 questions in all. Did they give you a copy of the multi-listing book of the various real estate things? Did they let you touch it and hold it and look at it yourself? Did they let you take one home, which you're not supposed to be able to do? Or did they refuse to do that? 40 different questions. The determination that demonstration existed was based on a combination of these factors. It was not just one single item, but many of them. 67% of the real estate offices had practiced discrimination. 31% of apartment complexes had practiced discrimination. With this evidence in hand, we confronted the Board of Realtors, who refused to meet with us. But then we went to the mayor of Lexington, and to his credit, he said, well, they'll come to a meeting that I call. So the mayor called the clergy of the NAACP and the Board of Realtors together in the council meeting room, and there we talked about what was going on. By September, the board agreed on a training program for all realtors and established a procedure aimed at recruiting more African Americans, more blacks to work as realtors. At that time, in Lexington, Kentucky, there were 1,500 realtors in the city, and 3 of them were black. I hope we made a difference. I know that today, the Lexington Fair Housing Council that we started still exists and continues the work that we began. Now, in our hymnal are the words of Dorothy Day, and I hope she's right about this. She wrote, "People say, what is the sense of our small effort? They cannot see that we must lay one brick at a time, take one step at a time. A pebble cast into a pond causes ripples that spread in all directions. Each one of our thoughts, words, and deeds is like that. No one has a right to sit down and feel hopeless. No one. There's too much work to do." So in the next few years after leaving Lexington, I helped establish what we called the Ethnic Racial Alliance in New Bedford, Massachusetts. Then when I moved to serve a church in Evanston, Illinois, I brought the president of the NAACP, Julian Bond, to speak at the church. When I moved to serve a church in Bethesda, Maryland, I welcomed a Tuskegee Airman to speak at the church of his experiences in America. He said, "They gave us a new plane without any instructions on how to fly it, except a book. And so I read through the book, and I got in the plane and started flying, and I was going after this German pilot in another plane, and I somehow read the instructions wrong, and I went by at about 200 miles an hour right by the German, who looked very surprised. He said, but then I learned from this that reading is fundamental. Read the instructions. 40 years after my experience as a fair housing tester, I found myself walking the streets again. This time it was in Sarasota, Florida. And my partner was the Reverend Susan Frederick Gray, the president of our Unitarian Universalist Association, whose term ends this week. Susan called me to say that she wanted to come to visit Sarasota so she could go door to door urging people to vote for Amendment 4. Now, Amendment 4, also called the Voting Rights Restoration for Felons Initiative, was an amendment to the Constitution of the state of Florida to be voted on November 6th as part of the 2018 Florida elections. Florida was one of 4 United States in the Union that had enacted permanent felony disenfranchisement. Means if you were convicted of a felony, even after you served your time, you would never be allowed to vote. It affected 1.4 million people in the state of Florida. The felons constituted 10% of the adult population and 21.5% of the adult African American population. Desmond Meade, who was convicted of a felony and then later earned a law degree after his release from prison, became involved in the voting rights after his wife ran for the Florida legislature and he couldn't vote for her. He became the head of the Florida Rights Restoration Coalition in 2009. He led this drive to qualify the Amendment 4 as a ballot initiative for the 2018 Florida elections. He and his coalition collected 799,000 signatures to get this on the ballot. We invited Desmond to speak at the Sarasota Unitarian Universalist Church, and he graciously agreed to do so on a Sunday morning at the end of September 2018. We invited everyone in the congregation then to join in going door to door throughout the city on a Saturday in October, encouraging people to vote for Amendment 4. Many of the congregation came that day. Susan Frederick Gray came down from Boston. She and I walked together on the streets. We knocked as a group, all of us together, on about 1,000 doors that day. And afterwards, we had a celebration at the church, and the ice cream company, Ben & Jerry's, donated free ice cream. Amendment 4 passed. 65% of the voters in Florida voted for it, 65%. In January of 2019, an estimated 1.4 million ex-felons became eligible to vote. But a series of court rulings accumulating in September of 2020 in the 11th Circuit Appeals Court restricted re-enfranchisement only to those who had paid off all their fines. In 45 years, I've seen many well-intended missions and vision statements by churches, but friends, things really take off when 1 or 2 people in the congregation become enthusiastic about an issue, when they get really strongly committed, and they start working on it, and they bring the rest of us along. Most of us, because our church members are small, most of our churches, because our churches are small, are even more effective when we join as part of coalitions of religious groups and community organizations, just as I became part of this coalition on fair housing and later this coalition of people working to restore the vote to felons in Florida. When we're part of a larger group, we're more effective. Now, looking out at the congregation, I see a gentleman in our congregation who has worked on prison visitation for years. I think he's fallen asleep. You will remember him as standing in the back of the church on Sunday mornings, dressed in orange prison dress, inviting you to sign up if you would like to visit in prison. And he is reaching a point where he might want to retire from this work, having done it for how many years? 10 years. And he's organized, I think he got 12 people the last I looked at the list who signed up to help work on this. But I'm sure there's room for more. And this is an anti-racist activity. And then sitting in front of him, there's a couple, Bill and Mary Clinton. They called me last August about their efforts to get out the vote. And I was impressed by that meeting I went to in August. It was so impressive to see so many of you there. And then I was impressed again on May 18th. Bill Clinton is our Unitarian Universalist Justice Pennsylvania president. Distinguished position. He called us to a meeting that night. He wrote to us, "Do you know that lobbyists can make unlimited gifts to Pennsylvania legislators? Take action to prevent corruption in Harrisburg by attending the Disrupt the Corrupt. Support legislation to limit gifts to lawmakers." That evening on May 18th, I learned that currently there are no limits on what lobbyists can give to public officials in Pennsylvania. They can just bribe them. Gifts valued at over $250 or $650 for travel, lodging, and hospitality, they're supposed to be reported, but there's no meaningful enforcement for failure to report these gifts. Lobbyists use gifts to get what they want from the government, and they destroy the trust between the people and the legislature. Legislators should be responsible to the will of the public, not to gift-giving lobbyists. Disrupt the corrupt. It's a coalition movement that's trying to change this, and we in this church are part of this fight. Fighting this corruption is a way to fight racism. Friends, things really take off when one or two people in the congregation become enthusiastic about an issue, start working on it, and they bring the rest of us along because we're so inspired by their work. We're far more effective, of course, when we join coalitions of religious groups and community organizations to bring about good, positive change, to end racism in our society. I'm a soldier making small efforts in this nonviolent battle. In this area, I'm not an expert. I'm not a know-it-all. I'm always listening, always learning, always acting to the best of my ability. I trust the words of Dorothy Day. People say, "What is the sense of our small effort?" They cannot see that we must lay one brick at a time, take one step at a time. A pebble cast into a pond causes ripples that spread in all directions. Each one of our thoughts, our words, and our deeds is like that. No one has a right to sit down and feel hopeless. There's too much work to do. Let's sing our closing hymn, Amazing Grace. I invite you to join me in the closing words. For those who come here seeking God, may God go with you. For those who come embracing life, may life return your affection. And for those who come to seek a path, may a way be found and the courage to take it step by step. Blessed be.